At the moment, 6 common food items are slowly starting to vanish from supermarket shelves. These aren't luxury goods or rare specialty products. They're the everyday staples most people already have sitting in their kitchen. They're usually so inexpensive that you barely even notice the price, let alone think about stocking up. But things are shifting. Some of these items have nearly doubled in cost. Others rely heavily on just one key growing region that's now facing serious environmental strain, and a few are still so cheap that people assume they'll always be there, until they suddenly aren't. What's happening isn't a coincidence or a one-off issue. It's the result of drought conditions, pressure on global supply chains, and rising demand all converging at once, quietly and without much public attention. No dramatic warning signs, just a slow tightening that builds over time. Because of this, those who are paying attention are already starting to buy ahead while everything still looks stable. By the time empty shelves become noticeable, the opportunity to prepare is often already gone. Here are the 6 items in question. Number 6 is canned tomato paste. It's one of those products most shoppers barely register. You pass it on the shelf, see the small can, the low price of around $1, and it doesn't really feel like something worth a second thought. But there's a single statistic that completely changes how that harmless-looking item should be understood. Roughly 95% of all processed tomatoes in the United States come from just one growing region, California's Central Valley. And that doesn't just mean most of the supply. It means almost everything in the entire system is tied to one concentrated agricultural zone. Every can of tomato paste, every jar of sauce on store shelves across the country ultimately traces back to that same region. In normal years, nobody really notices this level of dependence. The shelves stay full, the prices stay low, and the system feels invisible. But that kind of concentration is exactly what creates vulnerability. When California enters drought conditions, and it has done so repeatedly, farmers are forced to reassess everything. They start calculating whether processing tomatoes are still worth the water, labor, and risk compared to other crops. As growers reduce tomato acreage, processors receive less raw product. And when processing plants have less supply to work with, they begin prioritizing what gets made first. That's where tomato paste becomes especially exposed. At roughly $1 per can, the profit margin is extremely thin. So when costs rise, whether from water restrictions, energy expenses, or packaging, companies naturally protect higher-margin products first. As a result, the humble can of tomato paste is often one of the earliest items to see reduced production. There's no headline or official warning, just slightly fewer cans shipped out, and gradually thinner shelf availability over time. What many people don't consider is that even the packaging itself adds pressure. Steel, manufacturing energy, transportation, every part of that supply chain carries a cost. And when a product already sits at the very bottom of what consumers are willing to pay, even a few extra cents in production costs can make it difficult to maintain the same output. Higher margin goods can absorb that shift. Tomato paste simply can't. At the same time, demand is actually increasing. As grocery prices rise overall, more households look for foods that stretch the furthest per dollar. Tomato paste fits that perfectly. One small can enhance 4, 5, sometimes even 6 meals. It adds flavor and richness for just pennies per use, something very few other pantry items can match. Here's what that looks like in real life. A basic pantry, rice, beans, pasta, canned goods, can keep someone fed, no question. But after several days, something subtle starts to happen. It's not hunger exactly, it's repetition. Everything begins to taste similar. Rice tastes like rice. Beans taste like beans. The challenge shifts from nutrition to simple food fatigue. A spoonful of tomato paste changes that dynamic. It adds acidity, depth, color, and the sense that the meal has been properly cooked. That small difference matters more than people expect, especially for older adults, who are more likely to eat less when meals feel repetitive or unappealing. Nutritionally, it also has advantages. Tomato paste contains high levels of lycopene per serving, a well-researched antioxidant linked to heart and cellular health. It also provides vitamin A, vitamin C, and potassium, nutrients that can be harder to get in a pantry-heavy diet with limited fresh produce. Number 5 is cooking oil. A 1-gallon jug of vegetable oil used to sit around the $6 range in most grocery stores. Now, that same container is often priced between $12 and $14, which is close to a full doubling in a relatively short time. But the price alone isn't the most revealing part. What really stands out is the behavior of shoppers when supply gets tight or when discounts appear. The larger bottles disappear first, every single time. That's not coincidence. It's a consistent pattern that says a lot about how people respond to value under pressure. From a purely nutritional standpoint, the numbers are striking. 1 gallon of cooking oil contains roughly 30,000 calories. At a price of about $13, that breaks down to less than half a cent per calorie. When you look at food strictly through energy-to-cost ratio, very few items in a grocery store even come close. And yet, most people still treat cooking oil as something secondary, just another pantry item that gets replaced when it runs out, not something that needs much attention. The forces driving the price increase are complex and interconnected. Ukraine, once one of the world's major exporters of sunflower oil, has seen major disruptions due to ongoing conflict, affecting both production and export routes. As a result, global buyers have shifted heavily towards substitutes like soybean, canola, and palm oil. When millions of buyers all pivot to the same alternatives at once, prices naturally climb. At the same time, palm oil production, which is used not only in cooking but also in a huge share of processed foods, has been impacted by inconsistent rainfall in key growing regions. That reduces supply further and spreads pressure across all other vegetable oil types. Then there's the less visible but equally important layer: logistics. Getting oil from farms to finished product involves harvesting, transport, refining, packaging, and distribution. Every step depends on fuel, electricity, plastics, and shipping infrastructure, all of which have become more expensive in recent years. Those cumulative increases eventually show up directly on store shelves. For anyone thinking seriously about long-term food storage or preparedness, cooking oil shouldn't be viewed as a simple condiment. It's a core energy source. Staple foods like rice, oats, beans, and pasta are almost entirely carbohydrate-based. A diet built only on starch can look complete on the surface but still leave the body missing a critical component: fat. And fat deficiency doesn't show up immediately in an obvious way. It often begins with general fatigue, followed by lingering hunger even after eating, then difficulty focusing, and eventually reduced absorption of vitamins A, D, E, and K, nutrients that depend on fat to be properly processed by the body. Number 4 is canned sardines and mackerel. Just a few years ago, a standard can of sardines or mackerel would usually cost around $2. Today, most familiar brands are sitting closer to $3.50 to $4.50, and that's before you even get into premium versions packed in olive oil, which push the price even higher. In a relatively short period, that's nearly a doubling in cost. But people who pay attention to pantry staples aren't only tracking prices, they're watching what happens on the shelves themselves. The lowest cost options are the first to disappear. The basic no-frills sardines that used to sit reliably in stock start showing up inconsistently. Flavored versions or sardines in tomato sauce might still be available, but the plain budget-friendly cans, the ones most people actually buy, get reduced to a few scattered units pushed toward the back, often with empty gaps where they used to be. That kind of pattern is what early-stage disruption looks like, before it becomes obvious to everyone else. One major pressure point starts with the ocean itself. Sardines and mackerel sit low in the marine food chain, serving as key prey for larger fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. When fish population surveys show slower than expected recovery, regulators respond by tightening catch limits to protect long-term sustainability. It's a necessary step, but it immediately reduces how much fish can legally be harvested. Fewer fishing vessels are allowed out, less raw catch reaches processing plants, and ultimately fewer cans make it onto store shelves. The system adjusts quickly, but quietly. Another factor is ocean temperature change. The waters these species traditionally inhabit have shifted over the past decade. The fish haven't disappeared, they've moved. Many populations are now found farther north or deeper offshore in colder waters. That forces fishing fleets to travel longer distances, spend more fuel, and operate at higher cost per catch. Those added expenses follow the product all the way to the grocery store. It's easy to forget that a simple can of fish is actually the end result of a long chain of costs. It includes fuel burned at sea, refrigeration, labor, processing, packaging, and global distribution. When each of those inputs becomes more expensive at the same time, the final shelf price has very little room to stay stable. On top of supply constraints, demand has also increased. More people are now using canned fish as a serious protein source rather than an occasional backup. It's popular among people living alone, older adults on fixed incomes, and households preparing for emergencies or power outages. Any situation where a ready-to-eat protein is useful without cooking. When demand rises while supply struggles to expand, shortages and price pressure become predictable outcomes. Number 3 is instant coffee. A typical jar used to sell for about $7 to $8 in most grocery stores, but today, many of those same jars are closer to $10 to $12. If a household goes through 2 jars a month, that price shift alone can add roughly $70 or more per year from a single pantry item. Still, the price increase isn't the most revealing part. What stands out more is how the shelves behave under pressure. The larger jars are the first to disappear. Store-brand versions become hit or miss in availability. Even decaf options start to show up less consistently. From a distance, the coffee aisle can look full, but up close it becomes clear that what's left are smaller containers, higher per-ounce prices, and premium products most people didn't plan to buy in the first place. One of the main drivers behind this comes from Brazil, which produces around one-third of the world's coffee. When Brazil experiences droughts, unexpected frosts, or weaker than average harvests, which have all happened in recent seasons, the global market reacts almost immediately. Supply tightens, and buyers who would normally wait for better pricing are forced to secure contracts early, often at higher costs. As a result, farmers produce less, exporters hold smaller inventories, roasters pay more, distributors add their margins, and eventually that increase shows up as a noticeable jump in the price of a familiar jar of coffee. There's also a second layer of pressure that affects instant coffee more directly, and it's tied to Vietnam, the world's largest producer of Robusta beans. Robusta coffee is especially important for instant coffee production because it has higher caffeine content and a stronger flavor profile, and it works well in large-scale spray drying and freeze-drying processes. When growing conditions in Vietnam's central highlands are disrupted, whether due to delayed monsoons or weaker harvest cycles, instant coffee manufacturers around the world feel it quickly. They are suddenly competing with roasters and commodity buyers for a smaller supply of the exact type of coffee they rely on most. The end result doesn't usually look like empty shelves. It looks more subtle. The standard jars vanish first. The most familiar brands become harder to find. What remains tends to be smaller packages, higher prices, or less recognizable alternatives. When you break it down, the math still looks small on a per-cup basis. A single jar can make anywhere from 60 to 100 cups, depending on strength and preparation. Even a $3 increase only adds a fraction of a cent per cup. But for anyone drinking coffee daily, which includes a large portion of the population, that fraction accumulates into real yearly cost. In a way, buying at today's price is effectively locking in what your mornings will cost before the next increase arrives. Beyond the economics, there's also something more human about it. Coffee isn't a nutrient source or a necessity in the traditional sense, but for many people it's a daily anchor. It marks the start of the day, sits alongside quiet routines, and creates a sense of normalcy, whether that's reading news, sitting alone for a few minutes, or talking with family before the day begins. Number 2 is pure honey. It's one of the oldest preserved foods known to humanity. In fact, archaeologists digging in ancient Egyptian tombs have discovered sealed jars of honey that are thousands of years old, still intact, still recognizable, and not spoiled in any meaningful way. It's a food that has quite literally outlasted entire civilizations. That remarkable stability comes from its chemistry. Honey has extremely low moisture content, natural acidity, and antimicrobial properties that make it a hostile environment for bacteria and most forms of spoilage. Very few foods share that level of natural preservation. So the issue with honey today isn't availability. If you walk into almost any major grocery store, you'll see shelves filled with golden bottles in different sizes, shapes, and price points, all neatly labeled and seemingly abundant. The real challenge is understanding what you're actually getting. Experienced buyers have started noticing a pattern. The smaller decorative jars, the attractive 8-ounce bottles with polished branding, are almost always in stock. But the larger, more economical containers, like 4 or 5-pound jars that offer significantly better value per ounce and can last a household for months, tend to disappear first. Often, they're gone before most shoppers even realize demand is tightening. From a cost perspective, the difference is straightforward. Small bottles get replaced every few weeks, while a large container used daily in tea, oatmeal, baking, or cooking can stretch across months. For anyone who uses honey regularly, the long-term savings are substantial. But the deeper issue isn't just price, it's authenticity and trust. When honey markets come under pressure, especially alongside long-term and well-documented declines in bee populations across multiple regions, the supply chain becomes more vulnerable to dilution and substitution. On the shelf, many products still look completely legitimate, clear, golden, perfectly labeled, and attractively packaged. They taste sweet and behave normally in use. But some of them may contain added syrups such as rice syrup, corn syrup, or glucose-based sweeteners blended in to reduce cost. For the average consumer, that difference is nearly impossible to detect without lab testing. That's why experienced honey buyers tend to ignore the front label and focus on what's written on the back. They look for transparency, a named farm or apiary, a specific harvest region, batch or lot numbers, and clear production details. The key standard is simple. Ingredients should list only honey, or 100% pure honey. Anything labeled as a blend, or anything that includes corn syrup, glucose syrup, or similar additives, is essentially a different product altogether. They also don't rely on appearance as a quality signal. The clearest, most visually perfect honey isn't necessarily better. Real honey naturally varies depending on the flowers bees have visited. It can range from light and translucent to deep amber, and from mild in flavor to strong and aromatic. Color and clarity alone don't reliably indicate quality or purity. There's another detail that often confuses people and leads them to discard perfectly good honey: crystallization. When honey becomes thick, cloudy, or grainy, many assume it has spoiled. In reality, crystallization is a natural process and often a sign of authenticity. Over time, glucose can separate from the liquid and form crystals, especially in cooler environments. Heavily processed or diluted honey is sometimes less likely to crystallize because its composition has been altered. Number 1 is iodized salt. Salt takes the top spot on this list because it has a rare combination of traits that almost nothing else can match. It's extremely cheap, it stores essentially forever, it's used in nearly every meal, and there's really no true substitute for it. A standard container usually costs around $2 to $3, yet it can season hundreds of meals. When you break that down per use, the cost becomes almost invisible, fractions of a cent. In fact, across the entire grocery store, there are very few items that influence so many daily meals while costing so little. And that's exactly why it's so easy to overlook. Most people focus on stocking up on things like canned proteins, bulk grains, pasta, or cooking oil, and in the process, they often forget the one ingredient that quietly makes all of those foods actually enjoyable over time. And its role goes far beyond seasoning. Salt is essential for preservation techniques like curing, pickling, brining, and fermentation. Long before refrigeration existed, it was one of the primary tools humans used to keep food edible for extended periods. That function hasn't disappeared just because modern appliances exist. In a practical sense, salt is still a preservation tool, not just a finishing touch added at the table. It's also important to understand the difference between iodized and non-iodized salt. Iodine is crucial for healthy thyroid function, and for people who don't regularly eat seafood or other iodine-rich foods, iodized table salt is one of the most accessible and affordable ways to meet that need. For everyday cooking, it's generally the best default choice. However, there's an important exception. Many fermentation, pickling, and curing processes specifically call for pure, non-iodized salt. Additives found in some iodized salts, such as anti-caking agents, can interfere with fermentation cultures or subtly affect flavor and texture. A common mistake is assuming all salt is interchangeable. It isn't. The recipe usually determines which type is appropriate. When it comes to storage, salt is unique because its main enemy isn't time. It's moisture. It doesn't really expire in any meaningful way, but if it absorbs humidity, it can clump and harden, making it harder to use when you actually need it. That's why it should be kept away from heat, steam, and damp environments like stoves, dishwashers, or sinks. Instead of relying on one large container that gets repeatedly opened over time, it's often better to split salt into smaller sealed containers. That keeps it dry, cleaner, and easier to manage. For bulk storage, airtight containers work well, and in very humid environments, simple moisture absorbers like food-safe desiccants or even dry rice can help reduce clumping. One more detail that often gets overlooked is iodine stability. While salt itself remains stable for a very long time, iodine levels can gradually decrease if exposed to heat, light, or moisture over extended periods. That's why rotating stock, using older containers first and replacing them over time, is a simple way to make sure you're still getting the intended nutritional benefit. What makes salt so unique is that it's not rare, it's essential. And because it's so common, it becomes almost invisible in everyday life until it's suddenly not there. During any kind of supply disruption or stocking surge, it's rarely the expensive or luxury items that disappear first. It's the small, familiar staples that everyone assumes will always be available. Salt is one of those items. No one thinks twice about adding an extra container to their cart until the shelf is already a little emptier for the next person. All 6 items in this list share that same pattern. Ordinary, overlooked, and deeply tied to daily life, yet vulnerable in ways most people don't notice until something shifts. None of it is dramatic on its own, but together it paints a clear picture of how quickly, always available can quietly change.